Tuesday nights, FX brings you television's most intense cop thriller.
We knock down the doors other cops don't want to.
Critics are calling it TV's best new drama.
I don't judge other cops.
Mackey's not a cop. He's Al Capone with a badge.
TV Guide raves it's graphic and uncompromising, easily the finest series in a crowded new field.
Your turn to play bad cop?
I'm a different kind of cop.
The Shield, only on FX.
It's here. You hear what I'm telling you? In my mind, I created it. I told you, I created it, and it's real. Don't you understand?
Hello everyone, welcome to Struggle Session. I'm your host Leslie Lee III. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got a big episode, fascinating discussion about an amazing show, one of the greatest shows of all time, as relevant today as it was when it came out. Joining me will be special guest, first-time challenger Joe Mayall. He wrote a terrific article about The Shield for Jacobin called 20 Years Ago, The Shield Captured the Brokenness of American Policing. I had a really great time talking with Joe about Vic Mackey, Shane, the strike team, Claudette. But before we jump into the show, just want to thank everyone for sharing the show, for subscribing, for all the great feedback I got on our RIP MCU episode that I did with Jesse. It really meant a lot. Your support means so much. Whether you're listening to us on Spreaker or you're getting the ad-free and bonus content at patreon.com/strugglesession, strugglesession.substack.com, or sesh.show, where you can get all those links. Thank you everyone who's been asking about my health. I'm feeling a bit better now. Things are on the upswing. It's just a very, very long swing to get there, but I'm doing good. Thank you so much for all your concern. And again, for your support. You're really just helping me get the lights on here with your subscriptions, by telling your friends about the show. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me, to YB, to Spike, to Jackson, to everyone. Thank you so much. Couple things I want to drop in before we get into the meat of the matter. Just a couple of quick reviews. Because at Struggle Session, I feel like it's my duty to save you money. If you're listening to the show or you're putting down your $5, I want to make sure you're getting value out of that. So I'm going to save a number of you a decent amount of money right now. Alex Garland, Civil War. Now, I'm not going to do a full dive into it right now. I'm certainly going to cover it in a later episode. You've probably heard some of the controversy about the politics or the lack thereof. You've seen the hot takes. I'm here to tell you right now, none of it matters because the movie is just not good. Worse than not being a very good movie, it's a very boring movie. That was the thing that really shocked me about it. It was dull. It was just a dull film. Like the one thing I expected from Alex Garland, who wrote 28 Days Later. Very exciting zombie film. And Civil War, in a lot of ways, is a zombie movie. They just don't have the zombies in it. I guess it's part of the reason why it's boring, but just so little happens in it for the majority of the film. That scene with Jesse Plemons that everybody's posting about, that's a good scene, but it's the only one. So I rarely say this. Even if you were kind of into the movie, I think if you were kind of into the trailer, the premise, Alex Garland, I'm not sure how much you're going to get out of it. This is a wait for TNT. It's almost like a waste of time. Like all the discussions about the film not really giving context to the war that's going on in the movie called Civil War almost does not matter because it's boring. It's just not that interesting a movie. We may do an episode on it. I'll certainly dive deeper into it, but I just want to save you that money right now. It is not something that you want to go put your mask on and sit in the theater for. It's just not worth it. But something that you may want to check out, and it does tie into today's episode, Fallout, the Amazon series featuring Walton Goggins, who was introduced to me in The Shield. Some of you may have discovered him in Justified, but he's been in a lot of stuff. Everybody loves him. He's great in almost everything he does. He's pretty good in Fallout. Fallout is pretty decent. I'm not saying it's the greatest show of all time, but I think anyone who's genuinely interested in the game or the concept, you're probably going to have a good time. It's not that boring. It can be a little bit boring. It's a modern prestige TV show. It's 10 episodes, half of a season's worth of story, ends on a cliffhanger, all that good stuff. But more or less, it's kind of fun. And the way the show is written, it actually tries to feel like the experience of playing the game in these really kind of odd ways, almost similar to the Dungeons and Dragons movie from a year or two ago, which I thought was pretty good too. And one other quick one, and the less said the better on this one, The First Omen. Instant classic, stellar horror movie. I know these long delayed prequels can be very, very hit or miss. Many of them can feel very derivative and unnecessary. And I'm not saying The First Omen is the most original movie you'll ever see. There's lots of references to films that came before it, The Exorcist, Possession. Even feel like there's a little bit of Ringu, Junji Ito in it, but it all comes together to make a very, very, very solid horror movie with some genuinely shocking and creepy scenes and images. That's a don't watch on Civil War. Maybe check it out on the Fallout if you like Fallout. And definitely, if you're a horror fan, you gotta see The First Omen. But with all that being said, again, you can get this episode ad-free in all future episodes. And we got one coming up for our pro wrestling fans. Not only did I talk to the New York Times best-selling author, Josie Reisman, about her book, Ringmaster, Vince McMahon and Unmaking of America. I was also able to get Brian from Guys, formerly of Street Fight, and we talked about some modern wrestling drama. But that's enough preamble. Subscribe at Sesh.show, send us a voicemail to strugglesession@gmail.com. I love hearing from y'all. Thank y'all so much again for all your support. On with the show. So Joe, people are sitting around at their homes and they're watching procedurals. They're watching their Law and Order. They're watching their SVU. They're opening up HBO Max or they're pulling out those DVDs. They're giving The Wire the annual rewatch. But Joe, tell them, why should they be adding The Shield to the rotation?
That is a fantastic question. I think they should watch The Shield, one, because it's different than all those shows you mentioned. You know, it was kind of created by Sean Ryan to show the other side of policing at the time when it was made back in 2002. Law and Order was huge, NCIS, SVU, all that stuff. And The Shield stays with that framework. There's a kind of a tried and true pattern of cop shows of, you know, every episode has a case they have to solve, and then there's an overarching narrative that runs through the season that progresses. And The Shield sticks to that, but it does it in a different way by showing the more corrupt and, in my opinion, more realistic side of policing. I would also add on top of all the messaging that's in the show is I do think it is a great show. I think the acting is phenomenal. I think the ability of the writers to create tension and create those scenarios in which you say, oh, Vic Mackey or another character is done for this time, and then they find a way to squirm out. So
I wonder how Vic Mackey is going to wriggle out of this one.
Yeah, exactly, right? That seems to be how every episode ends, and then the next one picks up and you're like, oh, wow, that was an impressive escape. And it usually comes across with good writing. At no point during the show are you like, that's impractical or, they don't jump the shark or anything like that. But yeah, I would highly recommend The Shield.
Well, part of the reason the show cannot jump the shark is because it's based off of a true story from the LAPD, which is probably worse than most of the things that they do on the actual show. The show originally, and this was revealed by Glenn Mazzara, who I guess is maybe a writer or producer on the show originally. He made a pretty long thread a couple of years ago revealing that the Shield was originally called the Barn for a while, and then they changed it up to Rampart, which is the name of the actual division in the LAPD, where they had an anti-gang unit which operated like the strike force, committing crimes as their own gang, robbing drug dealers, all this sorts of shit. Real true life story. That's what the Shield is based off of. And so I think they said for a couple of weeks, Fox started promoting the show as Rampart, and LAPD threatening to sue them for it. They also wouldn't let them use the initials LAPD, claiming it was trademark. They had to they had to change up the badges so that they look nothing like actual LAPD officers. When you watch the show, you notice that it's set in a fictional place called Farmington. It's called the Barn. They never call it LAPD ever, because the LAPD was so pissed off that the show was really more or less exposing this real life scandal that actually happened, as opposed to the other procedurals that, paint a fairly rosy, positive picture on policing.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because, earlier I said, in my opinion, The Shield is a more accurate representation of American policing than something like Law and Order. And I've gotten a lot of pushback on that, specifically in comments around this article I wrote. And I always point to, hey, this is inspired by a true story. And typically when we say inspired by a true story, there's like a nugget of truth, and then the showrunners, really like blow it up or something like that. But in this case, I think the Rampart scandal, like you said, is like more far reaching than the actual show. In the show, most of the corrupt cops are on this 5-member strike team. In real life, the Rampart scandal, and for those who aren't aware, this happened in the late 1990s. An officer was caught stealing cocaine from an evidence locker, and they said to him, like, hey, if you point to some other corrupt cops, we'll let you off. And he pointed them to about 70 police officers. I believe 50 were brought under some sort of like penal, they lost their jobs, a few went to jail, a bunch were terminated, that sort of stuff. But, going with 50, which is 10 times what we see in the show. So, and they were doing all the stuff that we see Vic Mackey do on screen, such as, drug dealing, murder, framing suspects, all that stuff. It really is, one of the things where I think truth is stranger than fiction in a lot of ways.
Like you said, it was actually bigger in real life. And in the show, the strike team, they are more or less the protagonist villains. We as the audience root for them, but in generally speaking, the show does condemn them. But the other cops who are after them, they're complicit in it often, in their violence. Like in the first episode, there's a case that they're trying to crack that the more straight-laced detectives, Dutch and Claudette Williams are trying to break, this kidnapper, and they can't do it. So they call in Vic Mackey, and he cuts off the camera. He turns off the lights. He brings in like this torture kit to interrogate the guy right in front of the Captain Acevedo, who is like this who is the captain of this unit, but he has his eyes set on becoming the mayor of LAPD on this kind of liberal platform. So he's complicit directly in the brutality of the strike team, even though ostensibly he's trying to take them down. Whenever he needs them, he uses them, and that is consistent through all 7 seasons of the show. No, there really aren't any characters that are not complicit in the corruption of the strike team. So even though it's not 100% accurate, where it would be like the entire squad doing the exact same shit, it did show like none of the cops really get off the hook. Nobody really gets to be a good cop in Farmington.
100%. And what I think of every time I see an episode or just looking back on it is the phrase, you know how people throw around the phrase whenever there's a case of police brutality or police murder, like, well, he's a bad apple, right? And the full phrase is a few bad apples spoil the entire bunch. And I think that's what we see on The Shield. So Vic Mackey's out dealing coke, planting evidence, whatever it may be. And as you said, the quote unquote good cops are represented by Dutch and Claudette, and they follow like what is the typical like Law and Order framework, right? Like the show starts, they're at the crime scene collecting evidence, hunting down the leads, all that stuff. But in every episode, they somehow get pulled into Mackey's crimes. You know, like you said, they ask him to torture a suspect in the first episode, and he's like, "I'm your guy. I'll go get my torture kit from the back of my car." But like in other times, he helps their suspects escape because they're one of his drug dealers or something like that. And even Aceveda, the captain who represents like the politics that oversees policing in cities, is corrupted by this, right? And I think, you know, one thing I want to talk about later is Sean Ryan, the creator, and how he sees what he created. But I think either consciously or subconsciously, he created this story that shows, you know, bad policing and a bad policing structure means that there cannot be any good cops or any good like oversight of cops. And no matter how much you try and tinker or reform this system, the guys who are out there breaking the law and hurting innocent people are going to end up making everyone else around them bad cops. And I think that's like a really interesting takeaway from the show because, one, it makes the show more dramatic and interesting, in my opinion, but it also shows that, you know, we can't view American policing as there's one good guy and one bad cop, and those are separate. They are linked at the hip.
There's a quote from your article, which again is in Jacobin, titled 20 years ago, the Shield captured the brokenness of American policing. And it's this quote from from the new police captain, which was this: "We can't solve poverty. We can't solve addiction, but we can distinguish between the criminals and the citizens." And that line from the good cops is so wild, right? Like, you never will hear, Captain Kragen on SVU say this. They are always on a holy mission. And even though in like SVU, when you actually break it down and watch SVU, they do a lot of dirty shit too. Like Stabler will beat people up, but it's always like justified as the fact that they're just good people doing their best. It's necessary. And they are making a difference. They are changing things. If we did not have them, we would have chaos. The Shield makes it very clear, like, the cops are often the source and cause of chaos. And one of the brilliant things about the writing is that every action that the characters take have consequences down the line, one way or the other. There's one really brutal example where Vic Mackey brutalizes a suspect, and then that same suspect ends up assaulting Captain Aceveda, who again has been for years and years turning the other way to Vic Mackey's brutality. Yeah,
that is, and I have my gripes with the show and the people who created it, and basically how they interpret what they created. But I think you're 100% right. There are really no loose ends. That quote from the captain, who I believe is played by Glenn Close, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yes.
She kind of has like a season 4 appearance. I paused it and like rewound it 3 times and was like, did she just say that? Like, did she just say like cops can't solve addiction, can't solve poverty? Because that is what, you hear from abolitionist activists in 2023. And they're just writing it into a show in 2005. And the other part of that sentence that I think is super, I don't know if interesting is the right word, but noteworthy, is she says, we can distinguish between the criminals and the citizens. And that strikes me as just so fascist, right? Like the idea that criminals aren't citizens, that they're another group of people, because that boils up into white supremacy, classism, and how we see, people in impoverished communities. Most of the show takes place in poor, I believe, Farmington. As you said, it's fictional, but they talk about in the beginning how it's one of the poorest districts in LA, and it's majority black and brown people. And so for a police captain to say, like, we're distinguishing between the criminals and the citizens, as if criminals aren't citizens and therefore don't have civil rights or legal rights under the Constitution, is a wild thing to absolutely say. But at the same time, that's also like the critique that people such as myself point to and say about the police, that they view our society as like bad people and good people, and they're supposed to protect one and lock up the other at any cost. And it really is just I don't think the people who wrote this fully understood what they were saying by like having them say such a frank line.
Yeah, so before we jump ahead, we've been nibbling around this, so let's talk about this, because this is something that we've talked about on Stroll Session a lot. And my favorite example of where a film or a movie or TV where a film or a TV show can have politics far more radical than the people who actually created it. I like to point out the example of Fight Club, where when the movie comes out in 98, and the end of the film is Tyler Durden blowing up some credit card company buildings with nobody in it, no casualties. That's supposed to be horrifying. You can read a quote from David Fincher saying this. And of course, that's, 10 years before the 2008 crash and everything we're seeing now. And it's like, when you go back and watch it now, that's an uplifting scene. There's nothing sad about it. He may have not gone far enough, like that. That's how you see. So in that sense, time has shifted, has made it so that action that would have been horrifying perhaps in 98, if you were of the socioeconomic status of a David Fincher, is, not far enough now in 2023. And I think The Wire has a little bit of something similar going on, and maybe even similar to the Joker, because we talked about on the Joker, Todd Phillips is just a baseline Democrat and not a very smart guy, but he tried to approach what having the issue of having a chronic mental illness, what that would be like and what your problems would be. And if you're actually looking at that from a rational, logical perspective, you can come up with no other answers other than the problem is like capitalism, Yeah. Like that's just because that's what reality is. I like to call it, I didn't come up with this theory, but I think I coined it. It's Marxist realism. Like, if you're actually trying to tell a story about the real world, you're going to come to certain conclusions. Reality has a left wing bias, as they say, or something like that. I think a lot of that happens in this Shield, because when all these cops take these actions, that these real cops did, the only conclusion you can come up with is that there is no solution in policing. Right? There's just no bright side to this. They're completely, they cannot help or solve any of these problems, and even you don't have to be an abolitionist to see that if you're trying to write a story that has some verisimilitude to it.
I think you're spot on. I love that term. I'm probably going to steal that from you in the future, but I'll pay you all your copyright fees, so don't worry. The other show that comes to mind is Yellowstone, where Yellowstone is beloved by right-wingers as the show about how great America is and how awesome it is. And then you watch the show, and it's about a land baron who basically just drives around in a $300,000 truck all day while his minimum wage ranch hands do all his work, and the Native Americans he stole the land from, or his family stole the land from 100 years ago, are like pushed on to an impoverished reservation. And the creator of that show, Tyler Sheridan, still talks about how it means you should vote for Donald Trump and stuff like that. And then you watch the show, and it's just, like you said, when they went out and studied these places, they're like, oh, here's the 100-acre ranch that this guy owns and does not work. And then here are the indigenous communities that he stole it from, who have to live in like a small reservation. And it's one of those things where, as you put it so succinctly with, I'm sorry, what was the term? Marxist realism? Is that
yes.
It's, you can have as many like illusions about America or American policing and all these kind of fictitious ideas in your head. But when you go and study the reality, it's very clear what the reality is that, I guess in the case of Yellowstone, land was stolen from Native Americans and exploited laborers create the value from it. And in the case of the Shield, there's no way to look at the LAPD without thinking that this is a fundamentally broken system filled with corrupt officers, and everyone is not interested in quote unquote protect and serve. And I think that comes across a lot in how Sean Ryan, the creator, talks about it. He did a couple interviews about 5 years ago for the 15th anniversary of the show. And I have one here where he says, 98% of the time, Vic Mackey is doing the right thing. And I had to reread that a couple times because watching the show, every episode is like 98% of the airtime, Vic Mackey is torturing people or cheating on his wife or just being a total scumbag. And at first I was like, oh, okay, this guy's just sort of like a, I don't know, like a typical like liberal, didn't really think about his statement too much or something like that. And now rereading it and thinking about it, I think what he's really saying is that he thinks all of the torture and the civil rights abuses and all that stuff he wrote Vic Mackey doing is noble because it's in this pursuit of quote unquote catching the bad guys. And I think that's a really telling way to look at this worldview, which I know is shared by many white liberals besides Sean Ryan, that, cops might like crack a few skulls or plant evidence or something like that. But at the end of the day, they're just trying to help us out. And the fact that Sean Ryan was so close to the LAPD, he was like observing them while writing the show, is wild to me because he's seeing the reality, he's writing it into the script, but he himself personally is refusing to accept it. And I think that's a huge problem we have in society.
It's so interesting because, watching the show, you will just not come away with the idea that Vic Mackey is almost ever doing the right thing. Maybe right in terms of TV terms, like as far as like, yes, he's hunting down this, sex offender or whatever, but he like all of his actions ends up usually fucking things up worse. Yeah. Like most of the time, like much of the time, it works out right for him. Usually, like he gets away with it, but there's consequences for everybody else. And that's where I want to talk now, maybe jumping ahead a little bit, but you cannot talk about The Shield without talking about the finale, because it is one of the few shows where people tend to universally agree, one of these long running shows where they nailed the finale, where they really, really nailed it. And again, I think it goes back to making sure everything has consequences. And now, if you have not watched the show, we're going to get a little bit into spoilers here, just a little bit for the first couple episodes. Maybe we can avoid them entirely for the last one. But in the first episode, Vic Mackey murders a cop sent into the strike team undercover, basically to bust them for being a gang in their own right, send them to jail. He finds out that he's an informant, and he sets up this shootout with this gangbanger, and Vic Mackey perforates this guy, just kills him straight up. And then he picks up that guy's gun and then shoots the undercover, the rat, in the face in one of the most brutal, shocking scenes you'll ever see on a TV show. And The Shield is full of them. And they're earned, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. But that scene that in that first episode ends up being what the entire last arc of the show is about. 7 years later, it all ends up coming full circle in such a really brutal and sad way, because in this 7 years from you seeing Vic Mackey commit this murder when you first meet him to now, you end up falling in love with him. He's the anti-hero. And with the strike team, a couple of the guys, they only have like 2 or 3 lines in the pilot episode. They end up being essential to the rest of the show. And you end up finding out about this horrible, horrible family. And then at the end, it does not end up well for anyone, really. Like, everybody gets punished. No one gets away with anything. Even the quote unquote good cops end up getting punished in some metaphysical sense for their complicity in all of this.
Yeah, you're 100% right. I was so glad when I was watching the show for the first time and the final seasons started to tail back to that pilot episode, the murder they do, and how that is kind of the cause of all the plot in, I think, seasons like 5, 6, and 7, I want to say, because the strike team starts to like kind of turn on each other and start to look over their shoulders and distrust each other, and eventually they're fighting among themselves. And one, as you said earlier, it's super good writing, and it really makes you feel like, you know, this is an organic story and is pulled straight out of something that, you know, you can see as being real life. And then two, what else stands out to me about that plot line, and part of the reason I was so surprised to learn Sean Ryan thinks that his character is kind of a good guy, is in that pilot episode, they really show you that Vic Mackey like killed this guy in one of the most brutal ways possible, right? Like in early 2000s, I think with the exception of Tony Soprano, there weren't very many characters who were like cold-blooded murderers, and they have Vic Mackey like pick up this gun, turn around, and just shoot the guy in the head. And this isn't like how should I say, like a cliche, you know, the hero fires the gun and the bad guy falls over. Like they show the bullet hole in the guy's face, and I think the pilot ends with the camera on him. And the creators are really showing you with that shot choice, like, look at what Vic Mackey just did. He just killed this innocent guy who was arguably the only good cop in the show, I guess, if he was trying to bring down Vic Mackey, but who knows what would have happened if he survived.
Oh, well, actually, no. I watched it today. He is doing this because he wants to get like a promotion.
Oh,
you know,
you're right.
Like it's not a noble thing for him. He's like, he wants to get like a federal placement somewhere or something like that. He's trying to move up the chain. So it's not even, there's nothing like pure about it. Like if he says like, if I do this, I want to get, you know, oh my God, he wants to a deal with the Justice Department to go to DC, and it's not so dissimilar from the deal that Vic Mackey makes at the end of the show, where he confesses to his murder in order to make a deal with the feds and get a job with ICE.
You're 100% right. I forgot about that. There's like a scene where the eventually murdered cop is like negotiating, right, with the justice guy, and he's like picking his cities, and the Justice Department guy, I think, says like Phoenix or something, and he's like, no, I need a better city. I need Washington, D.C. And I didn't put together that that's exactly what Vic Mackey does at the end. That's an interesting storytelling kind of technique there. The other thing you mentioned right there that I think is super interesting is ICE makes its appearance in the last seasons as like kind of, they posit it as like the cutting edge of law enforcement.
Yes.
And like they have computers and like they're doing all this. And it's so wild to look back on, because now we know ICE is just, you know, deporting undocumented grandmothers and stuff. And they're supposed to be this like, they're supposed to be this like high tech, super efficient terrorism fighting force, which is wild to watch in 2023.
Yeah, that part does not age well. I don't know if you can blame the creators for that, because obviously that's what, you know, DHS and ICE were sold on as being like, oh, we're upping our game. And we haven't mentioned too much on the show, but I'm glad your article pointed out the show isn't just about policing. It is also about the war on terror too, especially as it goes on.
100%. Yeah, that was, I think if you watch it, the first 2 seasons, which were written...
Oh, I should clarify for somebody yells at me. Yes, the police were conducting the war on terror as well.
Cover all your bases so you don't get snarky tweets. Yeah, smart. But yeah, so the show aired for the first time in March of 2002, and it's pretty clear that the first few seasons were like written before it got picked up, kind of, because they're all focused on like, you know, the daily grind of being a cop, I guess. But as the show goes on, they start to make more allusions to the war on terror. They bring in an officer to the strike team who they call Army, and he says, I learned some good stuff going door to door in Baghdad. I'll hope to show you guys, directly showing how, the tactics used by America's soldiers in an imperialist war were brought home to police American citizens. They are constantly talking about Al-Qaeda and all these terrorist orgs and stuff. There's one episode that really blew my mind where he is a child. It's like a 14-year-old kid who wants to get into a gang, stabs someone, and claims to be affiliated with Al-Qaeda. And in response, like, the Department of Homeland Security shows up and they're like interrogating this 14-year-old kid. And it's wild because watching this, you're like, oh, that's an insane thing. Like, the kid just said, I'm associated with Al-Qaeda. Why would anybody believe him? But at the time, with all that hysteria that there was going to be another 9/11 any day, the show kind of posits it as like, it was reasonable for the Department of Homeland Security and ICE to come question this kid because he could have been connected to, Osama bin Laden, something like that. And it's really wild to look back on through that lens. And it really kind of encapsulates just how hysterical the country was during the early 2000s.
So let's get back a little bit more into the fiction, into the characters. There's a name we haven't mentioned that we have to talk about when it comes to The Shield. We've talked about Glenn Close. The Shield is one of the first shows to bring in these A-list actors into already established, crew. And Forrest Whitaker, and I believe season 5 and 6. Unbelievable performance as the most righteous and hated man in television history. And folks, this is a shoot. His character, who comes in for the specific purpose of vanquishing the evil Vic Mackey, who had, by that point, had already committed a couple other murders, robbed the money train, done all sorts of dirty, dirty, dirty shit. And Forrest Whitaker, movie star, comes in as this really noble kind of character who's there to put Vic Mackey in his place, put the end to the strike team, and people hated him. Not just his character, but in real life. He said people would come up to him on the street and tell him to leave Vic Mackey alone. He worked himself into a shoot about this. It actually bothered him. The cast talks about this. They said that Forrest Whitaker, he would come up to them individually and say, I don't get it. They hate me and they love him. I'm the one that's doing the right thing, but he's evil and they love him. Why? And he could never understand it. He could never figure it out. And it's really because of the fact that, and people talk about the anti-heroes on the TV show, right? And how, when it comes to Tony Soprano or the Joker, like, it's wrong to love these people, or Walter White, right? But when it comes to a TV show that's about doing bad shit, you're gonna sympathize with the bad guy. And Forrest Whitaker delivers this wonderful performance that everybody reacted to with just scorn because he was getting in the way of the plot of the show. But he still made that character so great and worked so well as this noble antagonist. And it was so intense. They actually, and this is a true story, when they finally had their fight, in I think maybe the last or second to last episode that he's in, Forrest Whitaker and Michael Chiklis actually hit each other for real. Michael Chiklis accidentally headbutted Forrest Whitaker, and Forrest Whitaker accidentally punched Michael Chiklis in the mouth and split his lip, and they didn't talk for 3 days. It was cool eventually, but like, it was really that he brought that level of intensity to the character, and it's a performance like no other. But it's just so funny that he could not wrap his head around why he was so hated when he was always doing the right thing, actually.
Yeah, that I actually did not know about how he was personally hated. I knew people hated the character he plays. What's his name? John Kavanaugh, I think is his name. but I didn't know that like he was getting like scolded on the street and stuff. That's tough. You're like, I'm just trying to do my job.
And Lim, the guy who plays Lim, people would yell at him about burning the money train money. Like people, I actually, when I saw the episode, if I had seen him on the street that week, I might have said something too.
In my opinion, like that's probably an effective framing, right? Like we're so conditioned to think that the main character is the good character that anybody who stands in their way is the bad guy, right? Like at the time, Vic Mackey is in everybody's house once a week for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years by the time Forrest Whitaker shows up. And they're just so conditioned to, oh, he's the good guy, right? Because I'm only used to knowing about the good guys and empathizing with the good guys, right? Because we see some of Vic Mackey's like personal life, and he has, I believe, 2 kids with autism that is kind of like a humanizing struggle. And so we're like, oh, he's got to be a good guy. He's just this loving father. And even so, when this cop shows up and has a very clear objective of just, I'm going to put you in prison because you kill people and deal drugs with impunity. Like that should be who we root for. And yet the way we consume entertainment and the way we think is just so warped that we're like, oh no, that's the good guy. And there he is walking out of the movie theater. I'm going to go yell at him in front of his family.
You know, this is something that comes up a lot when, like I said, The Sopranos or Breaking Bad. I think it was trending on Twitter not too long ago where people were saying, oh my God, I can't believe people hate Skylar White. She only is doing the right thing. She just wants to take care of her family. It's like, the show is not called Taking Care of Your Family. The show is called Breaking Bad. It's about dealing drugs and cooking meth. So anybody who gets in the way of that is a problem. Like, that's just how TV works. Like, you have these characters that are the obstacles to the plot moving along where, you know, you're not going to like that person, generally speaking. But I think what The Shield does better than Breaking Bad does is it grants, like, a bit of humanity to all the side characters, you know, Vic Mackey's wife, who's actually played by Sean Ryan's real life wife. You know, she is like in a similar situation to Skylar White, but she's never a problem because she's always written as like, I don't know. She's not written as she's written as like, she's complicit too. And she, you know, and she has her own shit going on. She just is never a problem as like a character, you know what I'm saying? Because she's always given a humanity that I don't see from a Skylar White. And when I look at The Shield compared to Breaking Bad, compared to The Wire, compared to your Mad Men, you know, really the only show that I think holds up compared to really well against The Shield is like The Sopranos as far as this genre goes. Like even when we're talking about The Wire and how it deals with policing and corruption, that is a show with a much rosier position on the prospect of policing. Basically every cop in that show is Dutch and Claudette. There really is no Vic Mackey character, even though I think it's Hank. He looks just like Vic Mackey, but he's not nearly as corrupt.
Yeah. You hit on something there that I think is 100% right, that the side characters are all given their own struggles, right? You really get a glimpse into the lives of people like, I think you mentioned Lemonhead earlier, who's one of Vic Mackey's detectives. I think they like give him irritable bowel syndrome or something like that, and so you kind of feel bad for him because he's always stomach ulcers, that's what it is. You're like, oh, that's a terrible disease, he's sick all the time. And it helps you like understand, or not understand, but sympathize with him even after you see him like deal heroin or something like that. And other shows, in my opinion, don't go to that length, so it's easier to feel like, oh, okay, I don't know, Silvio from The Sopranos I kind of know he's a bad guy because he, you know, just runs a strip club and like beats up all his dancers and stuff like that. But then they give someone like Julian in The Shield, he comes out, or he doesn't come out actually, but he's shown to be gay, and he has this struggle about coming out and stuff. And so that manifests when he beats up another gay person in an act of police brutality. And it creates this kind of this blurry line where, the viewer almost wants to feel like these are good people who are struggling, but what they're doing is absolutely horrible. They're just, their personal struggles are manifesting in police brutality. And you mentioned Corinne. She is like kind of this supposedly represents Vic's moral side. His family is always shown as his kind of, I guess you'd call it redeeming characteristic. But she takes money from him, and she asks at one point when he hands her a stack of cash, like, where did this come from? And he's like, don't worry about it. And she just takes it anyway, like very much going along with what she knows is illegally acquired money on some level. And I think the Shield just goes above and beyond exploring these secondary side characters in a way other shows don't. And I think that pays off. One, it's better writing. Two, it immerses you in the show more. And three, as you talked about, like when everything comes to an end at the final season and the series finale, all these plot lines are like wrapped up, and everybody kind of gets their comeuppance for all the kind of stuff they did on the side. And yeah,
Julian's character that you mentioned, really fascinating character and arc. Even watching the pilot again, we have to mention the person who played the character, Michael Jace, in prison for murdering his wife. He confessed that he did. Terrible story. But in the show, his character is a new recruit. It's I think his first couple of days on the job, and like the first thing he's taught again by Catherine Ditt's Danny, who is more or less kind of on the better side of the cops. She's having an affair with Vic Mackey, but no one knows about it. And it's kind of salacious. But on her first day on the job, after Mackey kills the undercover cop, she tells Julian, who she's training to be this new LAPD officer, that, hey, if a cop goes down, we gotta go out there and bust some heads. We go out and do police brutality, because if anytime someone hurts one of us, we gotta put these people in line. Just like we're like, just that declaration immediately. And there's no like pushback. There's no like other cops saying, hey, that's not right. Like he just goes out and he starts doing that shit. He actually goes out and starts brutalizing people. And that's just like so much more realistic, I think, than anything you see on almost any other cop show.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Julian. I believe he's one of only, oh no, that's not true, but he's a black character. And I think it's very interesting how they approach him. They being the showrunners, constantly show, how he is making the decisions. Like you said, Catherine Dent is like, we're going to do police brutality, and he goes along, but he voices his conscience and his concerns that the people they're persecuting and beating up are majority, young black men in LA. And there's one episode where they're kind of doing like a civil asset forfeiture scheme, and Julian and Catherine Dent, I'm just going to say, steal a car from a group of young black men. And Julian says like, okay, well, this guy didn't commit any crimes, but when now he doesn't have a way to get to work, so he's going to have to like deal drugs to afford another car. And we just created another criminal, what we're trying to solve. And then later in the episode, they pull over a rich white guy who has like a bottle of wine open for lunch or something like that. And Julian makes a point of being like, you're drinking and driving. We're taking your Lexus under civil asset forfeiture. And I thought it was really unique because there are other black officers, but Julian is the one who is constantly calling it out that like what we're doing here is pretty much systemic racism. But he also goes along with it. Like you said, he voices the concern and then continues to act in a systemically racist way by continuing the system that he apparently claims to speak out against.
Yeah.
And so I just found him an interesting character, and I think he's kind of like the writers being like, we know that there's systemic racism in this, but we're going to continue doing it anyway. Yeah, that's my take on him.
Yeah, so we've been talking about this show for almost an hour. We could talk about it so much more. Let me ask you, before we get off, what were some of your favorite moments from the show?
Ooh, that's a great question. The series finale, I think, is going to be hard to top. Am I allowed to do spoilers at this?
Yes, folks, we are doing light spoilers here for the season finale.
Okay. So I think my favorite part of the show is there is one cop on Vic Mackey's team named Shane, who is kind of like Vic Mackey's, let's call him like third-hand man. And he's never directly brought into the crimes in the way Shane Vendrell is, who's Mackey's second in command.
I think you mean Ronnie.
Ronnie, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm all turned around. Sorry,
Ronnie. And we have to say Shane, played by the wonderful Walt Goggins. I think this is where I discovered him. People are gonna be mad we didn't spend this whole episode talking about how great Walt Goggins is, but of course he's great. CCH Pounder, great cast. But please continue.
Yeah, we could do a whole episode on Walton Goggins' character. But Ronnie, who's kind of just like going along with Vic throughout the whole series, as you mentioned earlier, the series ends with Vic confessing all his crimes in exchange for a plea deal in which he gets a job with ICE. And as part of that, he gives up Ronnie. He says Ronnie saw all these crimes, Vic is immune and Ronnie is not. And Ronnie gets arrested in front of Vic in the barn, the place where in their special room where they planned all their crimes and all of that. And the acting from the actor who plays Ronnie, who I don't have his name in front of me, is phenomenal, because he's just been like, I was on your team for 3 years. Like, I did all your shit for you. I helped you out so much. And Vic just throws him under the bus. And the last we ever see of Ronnie is him kicking and screaming as he gets dragged into the cage, which is basically like the holding cell where they kept all the prisoners throughout the show, or kept all the suspects, I guess. And I feel like that shot is my favorite of the show, just because it really shows the consequence of what these characters did, right? Vic Mackey, who eventually doesn't really get away with everything scot-free, but he walks out of the police station while his quote-unquote friend, we always hearing about how cops are like, Blue Lives Matter, partners for life, that bullshit, while his friend gets like thrown into jail for all the shit he did. And it was super powerful. The acting is phenomenal, and it stays in my head like long after I've finished watching it. What's your favorite part?
So I have a two-part. I'm gonna cheat a little bit because the show has lots of great musical moments. I think a lot of people know about the Ba with the Daba, Kid Rock in the first episode. That clip mixed around every so often. As the one time it was fun to listen to Kid Rock. But when Lem's about to go away for a bit, and they play Disarm by the Smashing Pumpkins, and they're all saying goodbye. And it is doing one of these montages that they usually do at the end of the episode. And they're showing all the strike team, like Vic Mackey breaking the news to Lem that their plan for him to do a couple years in prison protected is not going to work out, and he's going to have to flee to Mexico. And they play that saddest song you ever hear, Smashing Pumpkins' Disarm, over it. And then in the next episode, where we see what really happens to Lem, and I'm not going to spoil it for people if you're just accidentally listening to it, but it's the most heartbreaking scene you will ever see, where he's just calling Shane's name. He just says it in the most heartbreaking way. I've only watched the episode once, and I have never forgotten the line, reading exactly how he said it. Shane, whew, it just gives you chills. And the reason those moments in the show work so well is because I think in part it still maintained that procedural element. You still spent most of your time seeing these people not doing mundane stuff, but doing mundane stuff for them, going about their day-to-day lives. J. Michael Straczynski, famous TV writer, actually posted a little bit on Twitter about this and about how quote unquote filler episodes, where I don't think The Shield really has very many of them, but they do have a lot of plot lines that are wrapped up in that one episode and not necessarily mentioned again. But it's those moments that let you learn about the intricacies of the characters, so that when the big moments, the money heists, the deaths, that sort of thing, they mean so much more because you know those characters as three-dimensional people because you've seen them in every aspect of their lives.
Yeah, that's well said. And I think that's a big reason why, even though I have criticisms of the show and particularly how it tries, or rather, I guess I have criticisms of the creator and how he tries to make his show or explain how policing is still good despite him showing everyone that it's very broken, is why I still think it's a very good show, because they do a phenomenal job explaining and detailing all those characters' lives. So you feel it. It's not just like, oh, they wrote that guy off. You feel the loss. You feel the grief. Very powerful.
All right, Joe, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people find you?
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. It was a blast. Thanks for geeking out with me about The Shield. Always fun. Yeah, I suggest people go check out this article on Jacobin. It's called 20 Years Ago, The Shield Captured the Brokenness of American Policing. And then if you want to find the rest of my writing, I publish everything I write at joewrote.com, JOEWROTE.com. Yeah, and then I'm on all the Twitters, the Instagrams, all that fun stuff at Joe Wrote. So,
all right, folks, good cop, bad cop left for the day. I'm a different kind of cop. Have a good one. Peace.